Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
And I'm Leslie Finger. We're going to be talking about charter schools, but before we get into any details, let's be clear. Paul, what exactly is the definition of a charter school?
The definition of a charter school is that it's a publicly funded school that's privately managed. A more elaborate definition is to say it's a publicly funded school authorized by a governmental agency, but the school itself is managed by somebody in the private sector, a nonprofit organization.
Where did the idea for a charter school come from?
The idea of a charter school was actually developed by Al Shanker, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, back in 1988. He thought an idea that was put out by a Massachusetts education professor, Ray Budde, was pretty good. Budde suggested that teachers run their own schools. That fit Shanker's own thinking because he never liked those school bureaucrats who, since his early days of teaching in an East Harlem middle school, had annoyed him. He thought bureaucrats who discouraged people, they were simply people who discouraged people from bringing about change in schools for no good reason. Well, Shanker wrote that essay, and it was read by two Minnesota school reformers, Joe Nathan and Ted Coldery. They invited Shanker to Minneapolis, then used the occasion to prepare a bill that quickly gathered steam in the state legislature, and all of a sudden, 2 years later, in 1991, Minnesota became the first state to have a charter school.
How widely has the charter school idea spread?
Today, over 40 states permit charter schools, and the number of schools has steadily increased each year. In 2014, there were roughly 5% of the public school population.
What is the theory behind charter schools? How are they justified?
Well, Joe Nathan wrote a book which best explains the original theory behind his thinking and that of the Minnesota legislature. Schools that are operated directly by the government, the local district schools, can't experiment very easily because they're subject to lots of rules and regulations. So why not set up some nonprofit schools run under private management that can explore new ideas? Then the public schools can learn from these new ideas and apply them to the public sector. So I call that the experimentation theory that justifies charter schools.
But is that the only theory there is to support charter schools?
Well, there's also the traditional competition theory, which is standard school choice theory that we spoke about in a previous lecture. Milton Friedman's idea is that if there's a lot of schools competing for students, schools will get better, and you could say that about charter schools. So experimentation theory is one idea, and competition theory is another idea. The competition theory making charter schools look a lot like school vouchers.
Changing the topic a little bit, can religion be taught in charter schools?
Well, that's the difference between charter schools and vouchers. In the case of vouchers, the money goes to the family and they can use that money to go to a private religious school if they would like. But charter schools are public schools established by a governmental agency and operated with government funds. If charters provide religious instruction, they are establishing a religion, something that's forbidden by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So no, they cannot teach religion in a charter school.
And how do students get admitted to charter schools?
Well, there's no one way that charter schools operate because it varies from one state to another, but generally speaking, anyone can apply to go to a charter school within a certain geographic area, such as a school district or a group of school districts. Then if more people apply than the school has space for, state laws typically ask charters to admit students by means of a lottery. That is to say, they have to draw names out of a hat or something like a hat in order to decide who gets in and who does not. Now, in that respect, charters are different from any traditional public schools run by local school districts. They're open to all the students living within the neighborhood of the school, usually. Charter schools are not neighborhood schools in that same way, although even in big cities today, public schools are less tied to specific neighborhoods and are using lotteries to admit students. So some of these distinctions between charters and district schools are breaking down.
But who gets to determine where we have charter schools? Who authorizes charter schools?
That's a good question. Every state has its own charter law, and the authority to set up charter schools differs from one state to the next. But everywhere you have to have some entity some governmental agency that decides who is going to run a charter school and who is not. So in some states, only school districts can authorize charters, and you tend to get very few charter schools in those states. But in other states, such as New York and California, the power to authorize charters is given to a statewide agency, such as the State Department of Education. In still other states, such as Michigan, some state universities have the power to authorize charter schools. Not all of them, and some of them do. And in other places, such as Rhode Island, Indiana, Wisconsin, the office of the mayor has the power to establish a charter school. In other words, there's no simple answer. Lots of different governmental entities have the power to authorize charter schools, depending on the state.
So given that, in what parts of the country do we find charter schools?
Well, as I mentioned, over 40 states have authorizing laws, so you'll find some charter schools almost everywhere. But most of them are concentrated in 10 states and the District of Columbia. There's Arizona, Colorado, Delaware, Michigan, Ohio, Utah, Florida, California, Idaho, and Louisiana.
Okay, and what kind of students tend to go to these charter schools?
It's more likely that it'll be a minority student or a student from a low-income family that's attending a charter school as compared to the traditional district school, simply because charter schools tend to be located in central cities where minority and disadvantaged students are concentrated.
Paul, how well funded are charter schools?
A 2014 study found that the average per pupil expenditure at charter schools is about 28% less than district schools. The difference averages out to about $3,500 per pupil a year. Charter operators object to this lack of equal funding. Others say that lower funding is appropriate because charter schools are less expensive to operate than traditional public schools. They don't have as many regulations. They don't have as many legacy costs, that is, payments to teachers who have retired and are on pension plans and are receiving health benefits. And they say they don't take as many special education students, so it's not as costly for the charter schools. So when you balance it all out, probably you would say charter schools have almost as much as the traditional public schools on average, though once again that varies too from one state to the next.
Politically, who supports charter schools? Do they have bipartisan support?
Pretty much. Democrats and Republicans have both supported charter schools. President Obama supports them, President Bush did, President Clinton supported them. Both Democratic and Republican governors have supported them. Many political leaders find that charters are a good compromise, and politicians always want compromise. They're a good compromise between school vouchers and no school choice at all. So if you're for choice but you don't like vouchers, then you embrace charters as the middle of the road way of going forward by introducing choice into American education. So with that broad base of support, charters have gradually grown and expanded, especially in urban areas, and one should expect that to continue in the foreseeable future.
So if charters have this bipartisan support, does anyone oppose them?
Well, the main opponents are many school districts and some teacher unions. Most districts don't want to lose students and the revenue that goes along with them that they get from the state. They don't like to see those students going on to a different organization. So there's plenty of opposition from school districts. And despite Al Shanker's initial support for charters, teacher unions have become concerned about the growth of charter schools because most charter teachers do not belong to a teachers union. And it reduces the number of teachers that the traditional district school needs, especially when charters are heavily concentrated within a school district, as is the case in the District of Columbia, Philadelphia, Chicago, and some other cities. Well, in the next lecture, we'll go into more details about charter schools. We'll look at the different types of charter schools, and we'll explore some of these issues further.